They warned us this day would come. In 1961, as he left the stage of history, President Dwight D. Eisenhower didn't speak of victory or peace. He issued a final warning, a prophecy disguised as a farewell. He said that the United States was being consumed by a new kind of empire, not built on freedom, but on contracts, budgets, and the machinery of war itself. The greatest danger, he said, is that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific, technological, and military-industrial elite. He was right. In 2026, the warning isn't a theory. It's the backbone of our entire economy. America no longer produces prosperity. It manufactures crises. Every foreign threat is a revenue stream. Every sanctioned nation, every security mission, every NATO expansion. It all feeds the same insatiable organism that Eisenhower feared. We don't fight wars to defend freedom anymore. We fight because the system cannot afford to stop. Look at the numbers. The United States government now hemorrhages more than $1 trillion a year in interest payments alone. The Pentagon's budget breaks historical records every 12 months, not because of new enemies, but because the debt demands new wars. The defense industry has become a lifeline for the dollar itself. As long as the guns keep roaring, the currency still circulates. Foreign buyers still hold treasury bonds, and the illusion of solvency survives 1 year longer. NATO's expansion was sold to the public as a matter of safety. But behind the slogans, every new member state is another guarantee, another obligation, another financial hook buried deep into the heart of the US economy. Washington's empire doesn't expand with tanks anymore. It expands with insurance policies disguised as alliances. Each promise to defend a distant border is a secret promissory note, denominated in debt and payable by the American taxpayer. Eisenhower, the soldier who defeated tyranny, understood this paradox better than anyone. He knew that when a nation's wealth depends on its weapons, peace becomes unprofitable. And today that is precisely what America has become, a peace-averse superpower. If calm breaks out, factories close. If diplomacy succeeds, revenue dries up. So the machine must keep spinning, infinitely and at all costs. NATO's endless expansions, endless sanctions, endless security initiatives are the rituals of an empire terrified of silence. Because silence would reveal the truth, that without global tension, America's financial system implodes under its own weight. This is not exaggeration, it's arithmetic. The national debt exceeds $36 trillion and grows by billions every day. Military spending absorbs nearly half of discretionary federal outlays. Every weapon produced sustains not only jobs, but bond yields and campaign donations. Peace no longer serves the balance sheet. We call it defense, but what we're defending is a way of life built on credit and confrontation. Eisenhower saw the door we refused to close, the door that turned the Republic into a corporation of perpetual conflict. Today, we're no longer standing at the edge. We've already stepped off the cliff. NATO is no longer our shield. It's our treadmill, keeping us running, exhausted, toward a finish line that doesn't exist. And like any addict who can't admit their dependency, the nation disguises its weakness as strength. It calls insolvency leadership. It calls expansion security. And every year, it pledges more soldiers, more dollars, more promises it can never afford to keep. Eisenhower's farewell was not a speech. It was a diagnosis. And 65 years later, the symptoms have metastasized into every corner of our political, financial, and cultural life. What began as a warning has become our operating manual. What was once a trap is now our identity. For decades, we were told NATO exists to defend Europe. The truth is harsher and far more profitable. NATO defends the dollar. Europe isn't America's ally. It's the asset that Washington has quietly mortgaged to sustain its own empire. The continent's energy, its industries, its markets, even its security, are the collateral propping up a financial system that would collapse without them. After the Cold War ended, NATO should have retired. But retirement is a luxury debt-based empires cannot afford. Instead, Washington reinvented the alliance as an economic pipeline, one that siphons Europe's stability to feed Wall Street's balance sheets. Every new NATO mission, Every arms package, every sanctions regime directs European capital and dependency straight into American hands. Look closer. Since 1991, the United States has pressured Europe to abandon cheap Russian energy and buy costlier American gas. It has insisted that every NATO member spend at least 2% of GDP on defense, and where do those billions go? Straight to US defense contractors, to Boeing, to Lockheed, to Raytheon. Europe's security is a purchase plan. Each missile system ordered in Berlin or Warsaw is another payment on the empire's survival plan. Washington calls it alliance management. In truth, it's asset extraction. When a country joins NATO, it isn't just agreeing to mutual defense, it's pledging future budgets, energy choices, and foreign policy autonomy. By embedding US command structures across Europe, Washington ensured the continent could never operate an independent military or industrial policy again. Europe became too entangled to leave without financial suicide. That is by design. Eisenhower foresaw this transformation. War as business, alliance as dependency. Behind every shared value summit lies a balance sheet. The alliance's noble language hides its function as a liquidity engine, converting European obedience into American solvency. NATO guarantees that the dollar remains indispensable, because without it, Europe's armies would run out of spare parts, fuel, and satellites overnight. Think back to 2022, when the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines severed Europe from Russian gas. The media framed it as a geopolitical necessity, but beneath the smoke, what actually happened was a massive transfer of dependency from Moscow to Washington. Energy independence was destroyed. A new era of US LNG contracts began. The richest continent on Earth was forced to buy energy at triple the cost, keeping American producers alive while Europe's industrial base bled to death. This wasn't chaos. It was a controlled demolition. Every crisis, from Ukraine to the Red Sea, drives Europe further into the dollar's orbit. As inflation crippled households from Lisbon to Helsinki, Washington called it the cost of freedom, but the only freedom achieved was financial freedom for US creditors. Debt flows east across the Atlantic. Weapons flow west. Everyone profits except the people asked to pay. The geography of NATO tells the same story. The alliance's front line may be in Eastern Europe, but its financial rear is Manhattan. The true battlefield isn't in Donetsk or the Baltic. It's the currency ledger. NATO's wars burn oil, metals, microchips, all things Europe must import with dollars. The higher the conflict, the higher the demand for dollars. This is the invisible mechanism, keeping the American monetary system alive long after the value left its factories. Europe's role, therefore, isn't strategic. It's structural. It's what allows America to remain over-leveraged and yet appear invincible. By chaining the EU's prosperity to US debt markets, Washington turned NATO into a collateral network, a system ensuring that when the empire's numbers stop adding up, someone else picks up the tab. And that's the dark genius behind it all. While Europe believes it's protected under the NATO umbrella, it's actually underwriting US insolvency. Every euro spent on deterrence keeps the dollar breathing a little longer. Every Arctic base, every Polish missile, every Baltic submarine is just another entry in the great American accounting trick, turning allies into guarantors of its debts. In the end, NATO doesn't exist to defend against Russia. Russia is the pretext. The real enemy, the one no one dares name, is arithmetic. The alliance protects a currency that can no longer stand on its own. And as the debt mountain grows higher, the leash around Europe's neck tightens further, one defense contract at a time. The truth Eisenhower warned about has now matured into full empire protocol. America doesn't conquer land anymore. It conquers ledgers. History doesn't repeat by accident. It repeats because power always follows the same path: expansion, addiction, exhaustion, and collapse. The flags change, the currencies change, but the pattern remains carved into the bones of every empire that thought it could outspend gravity. America is no exception. Long before Washington built bases across the globe, Rome built roads, veins that carried tribute and taxes from conquered lands back to the capital. But the flow never ended. It only grew. Every new province required more legions, more grain, more gold. Eventually, the imperial heart consumed its own wealth just to feed the limbs. Rome didn't fall because of one invasion. It fell because it couldn't afford its borders. Britain followed the same script. For 2 centuries it ruled the seas and financed its empire with debt. The British pound was the world's reserve currency, the sun that never set. And then came the First World War, the ultimate margin call. By 1945, the empire that had once owned a quarter of the earth was begging America for loans just to survive. Debt had replaced dominion. Prestige had replaced solvency. Now it's the United States repeating the cycle, shackled not by legions or colonies, but by commitments. 200 military installations circle the planet like satellites of imperial obligation. Each one costs money, fuel, materiel, a logistical black hole that swallows entire GDPs. NATO, which began as a shield, has become the infinite frontier Eisenhower warned about. A network of promises that bankrupts its maker. Think of it this way. In 1949, NATO had 12 members. Today, it has over 30. That's not expansion. That's compounding liability. Each new country represents another defense perimeter, another budget line, another spark waiting to ignite. In the name of collective security, Washington assumed infinite risk in a finite world. This is not strategy. It's hubris with a flag on it. History provides an uncaring mirror. When empires reach their peak power, they lose the capacity to distinguish between influence and exposure. The Romans built roads. America builds alliances. The British issued ships. America issues debt. All 3 believed the rest of the world would forever finance their dominance, and all 3 discovered the same mathematical wall. You cannot securitize infinity. Look at the Suez Crisis of 1956. Britain and France, desperate to reclaim relevance, launched a doomed invasion of Egypt. Their currencies crashed, their illusions of control evaporated. It was the moment the world realized the British Empire was a costume, not a crown. Eisenhower, watching from Washington, saw that humiliation and understood that was the future America would face if it tried to police the globe forever. He tried to stop it. He warned that military spending, left unchecked, would create a permanent state of emergency, an economy addicted to fear itself. But the warning was buried under Cold War propaganda and defense contracts. Every president after Eisenhower chose to buy time instead of truth. The result? A superpower carrying debts that rival its GDP and obligations it can no longer honor. The 21st century's conflicts, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, now Ukraine, all fit the same Roman timeline. They start small, limited, surgical, temporary, then they metastasize. America never wins these wars, it just franchises them. Every failure becomes a reason to spend more. Every loss becomes a marketing campaign for modernization. This isn't new, it's structural decay disguised as strategy. When Rome could no longer finance its army, it debased its currency with cheaper metals. When Britain's pound began to collapse, the gold standard was abandoned. Today, the US prints money through its Federal Reserve, exporting inflation instead of soldiers. That's the genius and the curse, a paper empire that fights with swap lines instead of swords. But inflation is just empire's entropy made visible. And now the architecture trembles. NATO's front lines in Eastern Europe echo the late Roman limes. Defenses stretch too far, commanded by generals who pretend resources are infinite. The empire can't retreat without shattering credibility, but it can't advance without financial suicide. That is the moment in history when collapse stops being a risk and becomes a schedule. Eisenhower's prophecy was not about politics. It was about physics, the idea that momentum and weight alone can destroy what pride refuses to balance. Every empire that believed itself immune to arithmetic ended in bankruptcy or betrayal. The math always wins. And in 2026, America stands exactly where those empires once stood. Grand, armed, indebted, and deaf to the echo of history whispering the same verdict. Overextension is not power. It's the countdown to irrelevance. The empire has reached the point of no return. Every great power in history arrives here, at the threshold where retreat equals humiliation and expansion equals annihilation. For America, that threshold is NATO. What began as a defensive pact has become an empire-wide ultimatum. Washington cannot back out, cannot scale down, cannot say enough. The system would implode the moment it admitted weakness. And yet, its adversaries know this. Moscow knows it. Beijing knows it. Tehran and Ankara know it. They watch as the United States drowns in its own commitments, and they tighten the pressure slowly, methodically, without ever firing a direct shot. The new war isn't fought with tanks. It's fought with trade routes, currencies, energy flows, and patience. Very slow, very deliberate patience. Russia bleeds NATO through Ukraine, draining its weapons stockpiles and its morale with each passing month. China bleeds Washington through attrition, buying Europe's loyalty with cheap energy and infrastructure, while America offers only militarization and sanctions. Together, they are reversing the polarity of power: energy east, debt west. The global order swings on that axis. Meanwhile, NATO keeps expanding as if numbers alone could plug the holes in history's sinking ship. Sweden and Finland join, adding thousands of miles of border to defend. Talks begin about Ukraine, Georgia, the Balkans, each one another fuse waiting for a spark. Washington calls it deterrence, but in truth, every addition is a fresh hostage taken by the empire's own pride. Inside Europe, a silent rebellion brews. Farmers block highways in France and Germany, protesting energy prices born of foreign policy decisions they never voted for. Hungary defies Washington, buying gas from Moscow. Italy whispers about strategic autonomy. Even French generals speak openly of Europe becoming a sacrificial buffer between the US and Russia. The alliance is cracking from within, not because of ideology, but because of arithmetic. The trap tightens not only geopolitically, but economically. The Federal Reserve can't raise interest rates without imploding Washington's debt load, and it can't lower them without collapsing the dollar. Either choice weakens America's global leverage. The BRICS nations sense it, forming payment systems, hoarding gold, launching new trade corridors across Eurasia. They are quietly engineering the post-NATO world. For the first time since Eisenhower's speech, Washington faces a scenario where military spending no longer buys influence, it buys dependence. Every NATO base in Europe is now a liability targetable by hypersonic missiles that America cannot intercept. Every supply chain for defense production relies on Chinese rare earths. Every ally that Washington protects can at any moment turn bankruptcy into blackmail. The empire has built itself a fortress with no exits. If it pulls back from Europe, the dollar loses its moat of demand. If it escalates, inflation explodes, the treasury runs dry, and domestic unrest follows. The elites in Washington know this. That's why the rhetoric gets louder, the propaganda thicker, the threats wilder. Every speech about unity masks an empire terrified of losing its leash. Eisenhower predicted that the disastrous rise of misplaced power would enslave the nation in wars it could never end. The NATO noose is the final form of that enslavement, a network that forces US leaders to choose between collapse and confrontation. The logic is mechanical, not political. The alliance itself has become a life support machine, unstoppable, irrational, mandatory. The new fault line no longer runs through Berlin or Warsaw. It runs through Washington itself, between those who want to double down and those who whisper about negotiation. But negotiation means acknowledging limits, and limits are forbidden in a system built on infinite credit and infinite war. So the engine roars on, the empire accelerates toward the wall, fully aware it's a wall. Meanwhile, Russia and China extend quiet offers to Europe: cheap energy, stable trade, independence from American inflation. These aren't just deals, they're escape routes. And when Europe eventually takes one, NATO will lose the asset that kept America rich, the obedient partner paying its debts. The noose tightens every quarter, with every new arms shipment, every sanctions regime, every feigned victory that costs billions more than the one before. We are past the point of control. The alliance now feeds on fear itself, the fear that one day soon the world will call America's bluff. When that moment comes, It won't be a battle. It will be an economic suffocation, quiet and irreversible. And as the grip tightens, Washington will realize the final irony of its empire, that the greatest defense pact in history wasn't built to protect it, but to hold it in place while the rest of the world moved on. Empires never announce their retirement. They fade behind slogans, debt, and denial. Rome blamed the barbarians. Britain blamed the colonies. America blames everyone but itself. Yet deep down, the arithmetic is already written into the bones of the empire. The collapse isn't coming. It's already here, disguised as normality. We just stopped noticing when the fire began. For the first time in modern history, the United States faces a paradox it cannot solve. The country that once rebuilt the world after war is now borrowing from that same world just to pay its interest. The juggernaut that promised eternal prosperity survives only by printing more promises. Treasury bills instead of legions, sanctions instead of soldiers, speeches instead of victories. This is what Eisenhower feared. The moment when the machine must keep spinning not to win, but simply to exist. NATO was supposed to prevent another world war. Instead, it became the mechanism by which the debt economy justifies itself. Every crisis is a budget extension, every enemy a fiscal opportunity. The empire's foreign policy is now a survival instinct, a reflex of self-preservation masquerading as leadership. When Washington speaks of defending democracy, what it means is defending solvency. But what can't be defended forever is the lie. The American consumer, deep in credit, is already paying the hidden tax of empire, inflation. The worker bleeds for wars they didn't choose. The savings evaporate. The rent rises, the grocery bill doubles, and the state quietly assures them that freedom isn't free. They're right. It costs everything. The price is no longer measured in lives abroad, but in livelihoods at home. And as the burden grows, the illusion of choice disappears. The next election will not decide peace or war, prosperity or austerity. It will decide only the pace of decline. The left will spend in the name of compassion. The right will spend in the name of security. The result is the same: debt expansion until mathematics ends the debate by force. This is where Eisenhower's voice echoes louder than ever. He warned that the military-industrial complex was not a temporary institution, but a living organism, self-feeding, self-perpetuating, indifferent to ideology. It will survive every administration, every scandal, every rebellion. Because it is no longer a part of America, it is America. The tragedy is that no one can disconnect the machine without destroying the country's economy. Lockheed and Raytheon are too big to fail. The defense budget is too large to cut. The dollar's supremacy is too fragile to question. So the gears keep turning even when every rational mind knows the debt spiral is irreversible. The empire can't retire because retirement would reveal the corpse under the uniform. Meanwhile, the world recalibrates. Nations that once begged for American protection now build their own shields. Trade blocs shift eastward. New reserve currencies emerge. The global South learns to survive without Washington's permission. Slowly, a new order grows among the ruins of the old, one that trades commodities instead of trust, gold instead of goodwill. When that order solidifies, the empire's final export will be disbelief. How could this happen to us? But the answer is simple. Because they forgot the warning. Because they mistook privilege for destiny. Because they believed debt could replace discipline and that alliances could replace arithmetic. Eisenhower saw it all from the start. And now you can see it too. The thin line between power and paralysis. The empire that cannot scale down, cannot step back, cannot even breathe without borrowing. The empire that confuses survival with dominance. The empire that tried to rule infinity and found itself trapped inside it. So what happens next? That depends not on Washington, but on those who still have something to lose. The individual, the citizen, the saver, the worker, the one watching this right now, realizing that every foreign crisis eventually becomes a domestic one. You can't escape this economy by changing your vote. You escape it by understanding the game, by preparing for a world where promises mean nothing and only real assets remain. Because when the final insolvency arrives, when the faith in the dollar fades, when NATO cracks under its own weight, And when the debt ceiling finally crushes the ceiling above our heads, the elites will have offshore accounts and fortified compounds. You will have exposure. Eisenhower's warning wasn't meant for them. It was meant for you. Because somewhere down the line, when the empire devours its last illusion, the question won't be who leads NATO or who sits in the White House. The only question left will be, what survives the empire that could not retire?